Hello and welcome to the Girls Fuel podcast. My name is Haley. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition coach here to help you along your health and fitness journey by providing evidence and experience-based knowledge, and as always, full transparency. And today's episode is a really special one. It's always really fun when we have guests, but today's guest is Alexis Lynch. She is a licensed mental health counselor that specializes in neurodivergence. And she has a whole slew of specializations: ADHD, autism, personality disorders. And she is actually my therapist that I started working with, oh gosh, over a year ago now, when I found out that I had ADHD as an adult. So, in today's episode, we are going to dive deep into all things neurodivergence, the cycle of burnout, self comparison to others, and just all things in the inner workings of our brains. Whether you align with being neurodivergent or not, I hope that you get something out of this episode. Alexis, thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Welcome, no problem.
We're going to dive in, and I would love for you to just define neurodivergence for us. What does that even mean? And maybe how can it impact somebody that considers themselves a high performer, like a business owner or just somebody that's used to being able to manage a lot?
Yeah, so neurodivergence is an umbrella term for diagnosis like ADHD, autism, anxiety disorders, OCD. There's more, but that's like the main ones. Highlights the community of people who diverge from the typical thinking. So I always like to say it's a difference, not a deficit. So I think that sometimes people might struggle with that because they wonder why they think differently, or somebody may not understand their communication style. But it doesn't mean anything is wrong with that person. It just means that they think differently.
Definitely. And I know we talked in the
Mhm.
beginning about how a lot of people around my age, I'm going to be 30 and maybe a little bit younger, are finding out now that
Mhm.
they are ADHD, for example, or that they're anxious, and thinking back on their childhood. I know I can see so many places in my childhood where I was like, wow, that makes so much sense about how I handled certain situations, or why I literally couldn't do algebra for the life of me, or why
Yeah.
I don't know my lefts and rights, or like everybody has their different things. But I even have clients now that are figuring out these diagnoses again in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I'm curious how you've noticed it impact people who are trying to build something in their life, be that a career, a family, or just trying to succeed.
Yeah, you had mentioned high performers too. So it's like whether or not you're a high performer or just someone trying to like live your life, right? Um, Neurodivergence, because it diverges from the typical, it can be a little bit of a struggle, especially if you weren't diagnosed when you were young and you're like struggling with lefts, the rights, the interoception stuff, proprioception stuff, or you're just banging into stuff and you're clumsy, right? And sometimes if family doesn't have a good idea of what that is, they're just like, oh, she's clumsy, and never go for a diagnosis. Or if you struggle with math, you don't, they may not take you, or the school may not try to evaluate for dyscalculia, right? Or a lot of neurodivergents have dyslexia or stuff like that. So those are things that can hinder you, but at the same time, it doesn't mean it's a deficit, right? It's just a difference. And so it's about finding those supports that are needed, which I think is also difficult if you don't know. And so I think psychoeducation is super important. And I know this, I've said it 100 times, is like the flexibility with yourself, right? That comparison to your old self, to who you are now, I think keeps you from being present. So there's a lot of things that go into it. It's just like more self acceptance. And so that way you can build what you want to build on, right? Or work towards that career path that you want to see. Or even sometimes people don't know what those are and they can't even envision what that would look like. And so sometimes I think it's really important for neurodivergence to even just do your own research. I think self diagnosis is even as important as diagnosis, right? And so I think if you learn those things about yourself, you can find more support, you know what you're looking for to research, and then you can help yourself from there.
For sure. And I'm sure you see this a lot with mental health, because I see it with gut health and
Mm.
hormonal issues as well, where you might know that something is different about you, but you don't know
Mhm.
why, right? Like in
Yeah.
my adulthood, the reason I even thought to look into ADHD for myself was I felt like I couldn't focus like other people that were doing like things that I was doing that were running businesses. I felt like I couldn't always show up and I didn't know why. I would fall into pits where I couldn't get off the couch for days and I didn't know
Hmm.
why. So, can you tell us a little bit more about ADHD dysfunction, maybe what that feels like to somebody who's not sure if they experience it or not?
Yeah, definitely. I think this will lead into burnout and executive dysfunction topics. So I think that executive dysfunction is really the thing that hinders us the most. And again, especially not diagnosed young. So you're just like pushing and trying to, get the grades that your friends did, even though they don't have to try as hard, but you're trying 10 times harder to get those grades. And sometimes that even leads to that early burnout in your 20s. And all of a sudden it just feels like you hit a wall and you're like, why can't I do the thing anymore? And so I think realizing what burns you out, what are some triggers for yourself, especially like sensory things. I think if you realize, okay, if I go into a crowd of people, whether you're socially anxious or not, does it drain me? Does it overwhelm me? And is it the noise? Is it the amount of people? Is it a safety thing? Like for a lot of autistic people, they're born with this sense of like unsafeness, like almost being born with PTSD in a way. Like nothing happened to you, but you're just born that way. And so your central nervous system is just wrecked a lot of times. And so when you start getting overwhelmed with those things, you withdraw and then you isolate, and then executive dysfunction hits, right? Because you've already put yourself out there so much. And then that leads to the burnout, right? And then you start feeling guilty because you can't do the thing or you don't want to do the thing. Even if you do want to do the thing, you still can't do it because your brain's just, nah, not going to happen until I'm done doing what I'm doing. So I think one of the first things you can really tell when burnout is coming, or yeah, when you can tell burnout is coming is because your executive dysfunction will start to hit in. And you'll see it little by little. If you're that type of person where dishes need to be done before I go to bed, and then all of a sudden you're like, and then the next night you're like, yeah, I'm not touching that. And then all of a sudden it just keeps going and the plates keep building. I think that is a time where we recognize, hey, my burnout is so real right now because my executive dysfunction has taken over.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that a lot. And just the feeling of overwhelm. Overwhelm
Hmm.
leads to, for me, that feeling of burnout. And that's where you and I have talked about this, identifying when we're starting to gravitate towards that burnout and
Hmm.
intervening. So, what would that maybe look like? What is an intervention?
An intervention for when you feel burnout.
When you're getting there, you're
Yeah.
like, I'm getting less functional, like things are getting harder. Do we push? Do we keep going? And that's something I struggle with. So I'm like, I'm running a business. Sometimes you just got to do
Right.
the things and go
Oh,
crazy.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I was like jack of all trades, ADHD myself. It's having it's hard balance of structure and flexibility, I think, right? The structure is going to give you the, hey, this is what I need to do. This is the guidelines. And if people are counting on you, right? I think that also helps is if people are counting on you. Or if you have a deadline, I think those things can be really helpful for somebody with ADHD or just neurodivergence in general, executive dysfunction issues. Because when you have that accountability, I feel like this is good. I don't know how this will sound, but like the rejection sensitivity kind of our anxiety pushes us to do the thing. Not that it doesn't exhaust us, totally does still exhaust us, but it does give us that little extra push. So sometimes it's about setting deadlines, keeping yourself accountable. That's why like body doubling works so well. So if you do have to do the thing because you're a business owner or whatever it is, sometimes calling on friends to be like, can you just sit on the computer with me while I do this? You don't even have to talk to me. Or just like, come sit in my house so I feel like there's some accountability of some sort, right? There's even websites now where, especially for entrepreneurs, where you can go on there and it's just 10 people sitting on their computer in silence with each other to do body doubling. And then sometimes that'll motivate us too. And then, so that's like the structure, some guidelines for yourself. But the flexibility part is if you don't have the capacity to do the thing, don't do it because you're just going to feel bad for the fact that you sat there for 4 hours staring at the screen, wrote two words, and didn't really accomplish anything. So I think it's allowing yourself those breaks when you need it. This is more intervention, right? So breaks when you need it, even if that's like a sensory experience. So maybe go on a 10-minute walk and look around and see like how many green things do you see? How many red things do you see? Really just grounding yourself in the moment because I think what happens in burnout is either we look to the past and compare ourselves to old self and then we feel depressed, right? Or we're like, oh my God, how am I going to do this thing? I'm going to fear failure, right? Perfectionism. And then that's anxiety because we're looking too far forward. And so I think it's about staying in the present so that way you can evaluate and meet yourself where you're at in that moment. I think the only other thing really is about prevention from burnout, which doesn't always work because we lack interoception. So we don't always know how we feel. And so prevention would be knowing what those triggers are, setting up those guidelines for yourself, maybe using the Pomodoro effect if that works for you. So things like that.
Definitely. No, that's really helpful. And I feel like a lot of people get a diagnosis of ADHD or anxiety and they only see the bad things about it. And I know that was the case for me for a long time. So if you have somebody that comes to you and that's what they're struggling with, I would love for you to share some of the comments neurodivergent might have and
Yeah.
maybe even to bring up some of the weaknesses just because I think awareness is really helpful in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, how do I put this? I do think the negatives are very highlighted, even in society, even in the sense of like when people are like, "Oh my God, I'm OCD," or "Oh my God, that's such an ADHD moment," and it's so it minimizes those diagnoses, but really only is highlighting the difficult parts. And there is so many strengths that come with that. That's why we call it like a neurodivergent superpower. That's why we use the word superpowers a lot of time, right? So I think that some of the strengths can be being able to handle multiple tasks. Some people have this photographic memory where they can go back and be like, this is exactly what it smelled like. This is what it looked like. They can remember every detail. They have, special interests. And when we have special interests, we know all the things. Like, and if we don't know all the things, we will find it out for you. You know what I mean? It's like this curiosity of we need to know. It will not beat me. You know what I mean? So I think those are some strengths. Some people have like really strong numeracy skills. Now that's hit or miss, right? Because I'm ADHD and most autistic people like say that most autistic people, this is what society says, is very good. Oh, you must be really good at math. No, I have dyscalculia. Please don't talk about numbers with me. I'll probably throw up. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Yeah, as you were saying, there's quite a few. And I think too, with being able to have those type of critical thinking skills and stuff like that, it also gives work, friends, relationships, fresh perspectives on things, right? 'Cause we're diverging from the typical. So we're going to have these typical thoughts and feelings, but if we're diverging, we're going to give you a whole other perspective on things.
No, definitely. And it's also, I read that a lot of times neurodivergents can be empaths, which
Oh,
can be
yeah.
good, but it can be exhausting. Can you tell us about
Hmm.
that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting correlation is neurodivergence and because of the amount of sensitivities, right? And I almost was just now, I was just thinking this is like almost like the chicken or the egg. Were we empaths first? Did it just come together? Or because of all the sensitivities that we've experienced, do we become a little bit more empathic? So I'm not sure what that answer is, but I think maybe it's all of them. So it's one of those things. If you're born with a bunch of sensitivities, you're going to adjust your experience to be able to handle those things. Your nervous system's going to adjust as much as it can anyway, right? And so I think I almost lost my train of thought. This is an ADHD moment, right? Can you say it again? I
Gosh,
lost my train of
do I
thought.
remember what I asked you. I was just,
See, but
um,
I think this is good. People need to know.
yes, they do. Just thinking about, especially, I'm sure it happens with your work, but especially with mine. And I know a lot of coaches listen to my podcast, the struggle of being an empath when already dealing with dysfunction and sensitivity.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes, we're back. So I think I got too excited about that. And then it just was too many thoughts. Okay. So you have all these sensitivities, you're adjusting your experience. And as a kid, we don't know we're empaths, right? We're just going through life, just doing the things we think we're supposed to be doing, right? For some neurodivergent kids, it's not even that. It's more of willy nilly, just like out here living our lives, being the weird kid. You know what I mean? And I think if nobody really educates us on being an empath or absorbing other energies, then sometimes that leads to even more feelings that we aren't able to identify because of that lack of interoception, right? And then it's a matter of, oh my God, do I feel that way? Is it that person's feelings? And we can't even separate that in our head. We just feel overwhelmed with emotions. And I think that's the point, that's the part that could be helpful intervention wise is to ask yourself, is it my feelings and thoughts or somebody else's? right? Because those are two different things, thoughts versus feelings. And I think the feelings part is what gets us in trouble because we're not always great with that. And so we have to figure out a way to separate those things, especially if you're not great with social skills. That can even hinder it a little bit more. And I guess that would go into maybe a weakness of neurodivergence, right? So yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer because we're not going to be able to not be empaths, right? I think that's also it's like a blessing and a curse, right? Where it's I can connect with people, I am sensitive to them, I can see their needs, I can see the behavior changes, I can see everything, right? But if you don't know what to do with it, it can really affect your own thoughts and feelings.
Yes, and it's almost like one of those things where it's like, are they acting different or am I making it up sometimes? Are we
Yeah.
perceiving things or is it reality? Because something that I've realized being neurodivergent is that like my brain thinks about things that other people like probably never ever think about. Like we talked about that once, like being around people and being in crowds, like without even realizing it, I'm just observing everything. Like my brain is
Hmm.
always going. I'm always like, what is that person thinking? Or are they having fun? Or what is she doing over there? I'm not just like living unless
Yeah.
I'm really intentional about being present. My brain is always, do they need anything? Is she okay? And that can
Hmm.
cause people to feel a certain way because they're not having any thoughts, but you're making it up that they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay if I turn this around on you and ask you a question?
Yeah,
How do you decipher between when that's ADHD moment versus anxiety?
probably both.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was wondering is you're sitting there and because I totally agree. Ever since I was a kid, I've always said like people watching is almost like a social experiment. And so sometimes we feel like we're just like in this social experiment all of the time with
Mhm.
people. And then we're picking apart stuff and not in a bad way. It's just the way that we're like living our life. But sometimes I wonder because we are so in our head and we're watching everybody else and not being present, how much anxiety that brings,
Oh yeah,
right? Because
probably
then you
both.
got to think that's on top of like sensory issues or social anxiety. So it's like this just cluster of stuff happening, right? Yeah, I think that again, not that anxiety is a bad thing, because if we didn't have anxiety, we couldn't have run from bears and lions as cave people, right? We needed to do those things. And I think that's what drives us sometimes, right? If you are in a place you want to be in and you're people watching and you're having a good time, that anxiety might drive you to be excited. You know what I mean? But if you're starting to get overwhelmed and you're like doing the people watching thing, that's gonna be a little different.
Yes. And it's something I've learned to turn on and off and just be like, fuck that. That doesn't matter. What
Yeah.
anybody else thinks doesn't matter, whether they think it or not. Just do you. But that is something that I've always struggled with. Like
Hmm.
being in big groups with one-on-one friends, not an issue, but in big groups, it's one of those things that I feel like
Hmm.
I've always noticed was different about me. But until I got my diagnoses of anxiety and ADHD, literally never made sense. I was just like, does everybody think like this? And the answer is probably
Yeah. That's why it's important to find your tribe, right? Find the tribe that does diverge with you, or even because it's not like I want to separate neurotypicals from divergent, right? But it's like finding those neurotypical people who just understand you or accept you for you, right? Having the tribe is still fantastic because then you can be weird together. You and I just had a moment of, I don't remember what you just said, right? And we're okay with that. Sometimes you just need the people that are okay with things like that.
Yes, for sure. And that's I think a big thing that people talk about online now too is just being your most authentic self. Whatever
Yeah.
that is.
I find that to be so important. And because I don't really necessarily believe in the saying like, oh, you be your best self. Because some people, what if they've never been their best self? What if they don't even know what that looks like?
What does that
Right.
even mean?
Exactly. That can mean something different for everybody. Perception is reality, right? So it's one of those things, getting more in tune with who you are and just aligning yourself to what that is, right? Sometimes I'll do stuff with people, especially people who are having a hard time with their identity, which does happen a lot of times for neurodivergent people, right? Especially if you've been masking for so long and you just don't know. I'm trying to think about so like I had a client one time, was a good example. I was like, okay, so if you're doing all this masking and you think this is the proper way to do it, if we took that mask off, who would you be? And they're like, I don't know. And I was like, if your name's Chris, I'm just making names up. If your name's Chris, you're still Chris. It mask, like it was a Chris mask. And then under that is just still Chris. So I think people even struggle to even realize that because they've been masking for so long. They just became that. And so they don't know who their authentic self is. And so I'll start working with them on like values and relationships and what are your relationships values, and start to see if do your values align with those people, or are you even living up to your values that are aligned with you, right? And then you can make changes from there. And that's the flexibility, that's the adaptability, right? Is being able to do that so you can be your more authentic self.
No, I like that a lot. The values thing is something that I feel can be really challenging, but I like how you broke it down to being what are your values in the relationship regard? And then maybe even what are your values with work? What are your values for your self-care? Like breaking it down into smaller chunks, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. I was ready to say, I think chunking is always the way to go. Again, like little bits of information at a time. Again, neurodivergence, we take so long to process things. It's like that 2002 Dell. We just are on dial up. We need time. So it's give yourself that time for that.
And earlier we were talking about burnout and maybe even being an overachiever at a young age leading to burnout. And I'm wondering too if any of that has to do with having to work so hard at being younger to mask.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't know. I know that thinking
No.
back, I masked a lot when I was a kid to fit in, but I didn't know that
Mm,
it was like a thing to do. So I'm
yeah.
curious, you can tell us a little bit more about what you've seen with people that do achieve a lot when they're younger, and then as they get into maybe their 30s, what maybe burnout looks like. And I know that's something we've talked about for myself is even comparing yourself to the old version of yourself as you age. So I used to have more energy. I used to be able to do this. Tell me a little bit about how that might have an impact on mental health.
Yeah, I was like, there's so many memes right now too that are like, were you the neurodivergent kid that read 10 books a week? You probably were actually disassociating. Were you the overachiever growing up and now you don't even know how to make dinner because you aren't functioning, right? So, yes, I would say, especially like we're masking and you don't know you're masking because you're a teenager or whatever you are. And it's up until I think it's like 10 to 12, don't quote me, you don't really have this perception of people on the outside. It's very much about you. But then when you become that like teenager, people start to exist on the outside, and we have this invisible audience is what they call it, right? And we're like, are they judging me? I need to make sure I fit in so that I don't look different or I don't look weird, especially if you're already being called the weird one. You're probably going to try a little bit harder or overcompensate in some way. So that might even start the burnout phase, right? Or even if even younger, some neurodivergent kids like kindergarten have perfection issues
Wow.
or self-esteem issues even. Like right now I have a kid, not to he's ADHD kid who stroke he doesn't if he gets something wrong in class, he's in third grade. If he gets something wrong in class, he's not worried that other people are judging him, or he's not embarrassed because of that. He's judging himself. He feels dumb. So it can be all sorts of stuff. So a third grader who feels that way about himself is probably going to burn out a little faster than somebody who didn't really experience those things. Back to being a teenager, you have this invisible audience, you're trying to fit in. I think that's also a human thing, right? We want to fit into a box because it makes more sense to us versus being complex. So you do that. If you're an overachiever in school, you get the good grades. Maybe your family cares or doesn't care. Doesn't really matter because if you're overachieving, right? For some, they go into college and it's the same stuff. So you're just like pushing and pushing, and you may feel like you have the energy, or the days that you don't have energy, you drink 10 monster drinks or whatever you do, and you just keep going anyways. But I think because of that lack of interoception that we have to maybe not know how we're actually feeling, we push through things that we're already burnt out. We're pushing through stress, pushing through like crazy anxiety, right? And then we're just like running out of steam. And so eventually, which we never know when it's going to happen, it just happens. I feel like you just wake up and you're like, what happened? You literally just hit a wall. And so I think it really depends on how much masking, how much pushing you're doing, how much pushing your family's doing to you too. I think environment is very important for neurodivergence. I think even your environment can change so much. That's why it's very easy for neurodivergent people to get traumatized. It's because we're so sensitive and the environment's so important. And a lot of people don't necessarily see that. And not in a bad way. They just, it's different. So they
Yeah.
don't even realize. So many reasons to burn out. And in your 30s is about evaluating your life, right? What's my career path? What do I want my relationships? You're like like developmentally, you're solidifying these like life aspects, right? And for some people who have burnt out in their 20s, they're like, shit, I haven't done any of that. You know what I mean? And so they start beating themselves up. Oh, I should be able to do this. I could have done that. I see my friends on Instagram who are living their best life, right? But like we talked about before, we don't realize that best life may not be their authentic life, right? But
Not
we
even
still
human.
feel like, exactly. So it's like all these should haves and could haves are really about expectations, right? And our expectations for ourselves. And just like those thoughts and feelings as an empath, I think it's more about separating, is it the success I think should happen, or is it the success that like society's placed on us? Right. And I think everybody's on their own timeline. So your measure of success can be totally different per person, right? Perception is reality. I think that's so important. Perception is reality.
I like that. That is a really helpful way to think about it too. And something else that I wanted to ask you is how can someone, maybe whether they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, stop comparing themselves to a old version of themselves that they idolize, even if that version of themselves wasn't the healthiest because they were doing all the caffeine and they were chronically under eating to lose weight and they were doing all the things wrong, but that version of themselves is still like the gold standard. Because I see that a lot with clients trying to fit back in their high school jeans or the things that they did in college don't work anymore mentally, physically.
Yeah, I think in a simple way, it's meeting yourself where you are in the moment, like in that present moment, right? Because circumstances are different. Who you are as a person might be a little bit different. Your physical capabilities might be different. Your mental health might be different. There's so many things. And I think we forget about that because maybe that image of us is so fresh. They were like, oh, we could definitely do that. And it's okay. If you were like diagnosed with POTS or something, maybe we can't do that anymore. Yes. Do we have a grieving period where we say, I miss the old me? I really liked when I was like that. Yeah, absolutely. You can love those parts about yourself, but those are parts of you. And then a different timeline, right? We're in this timeline now and who you are right now. So again, like the divergence typical thing, right? How do I adjust to now? Right? How do I adjust to who I am right now versus who I was back then? Right? What if you've had injuries? What if you had surgeries? There's so many things that could hinder that. And I think because we want to reach that goal so bad, we keep this bar way over here when really it should be like here. And so even if we reach this bar, we're like, I'll never do this. So I just won't be good enough. Right. And then we're doing that negative labeling thing where we're totally dismissing all the good things about ourselves. Right. And it's okay. So if you used to exercise 5 times a day, 2 a days, blah, blah. Right. Let's start with baby steps of we can try one day and see what happens. Maybe not a 2 a day. That seems extreme. But one day for an hour and see what happens. If that works, 1% is better than nothing, right? And you can you may not even slowly be able to go up to what you used to be, but you're going to figure out what works for you now.
Yes, for sure. And especially speaking in terms of the nutrition and the exercise side of things, something if you are comparing yourself to how fit you used to be or how easy things were, how motivated, I want you to ask yourself at what cost? Because I can think back
Yeah.
to that version of myself that was however many pounds lighter and everybody thought was the fit friend, but I was miserable. I was afraid
Yeah.
of doubt. I was afraid of weight gain and I had no life outside of that. So that's another thing too, is I think
Hmm.
more and more women, especially, are starting to realize that there is a better way to go about things that isn't going to burn you to the ground when it comes to your health. And that's
Hmm.
too, like something that you and I talk about is in terms of growing a business too, getting
Hmm.
compared to other business owners or comparing yourself to others or how high performing maybe you used to be and balancing that like ambition with the self
Hmm.
acceptance, especially when like the goal might seem out of reach is something that I feel like I've struggled with too. And I'm curious if you see that a lot and with high performers and maybe why those struggles might be there.
Yeah. If you have high anxiety, your perfectionism's probably a little higher too. And so sometimes that perfectionism is like fear of failure, or I'm not going to be good enough, or people won't like me, or I'm not going to look as good as I did. And then whatever. It's that whole if this, then that. And I think that again goes back to the expectations that either we have for ourselves or we've adapted or adopted from social standards. And it's so interesting to me because most neurodivergent people don't fit into typical social standards, but for some reason, we try so hard. If we lack the self acceptance part, especially, we try so hard to fit in. And I think that also tries to burn us out because it just leads to so much more masking, and that masking takes us away from who we are. It takes us away from that alignment of our values and what we truly believe, right? And who we are as a person. And so we're constantly like trying to live up to this particular expectation. And whether the expectation is coming from you or society or whatever it is, right? I think that just really drives burnout because of it driving the masking. And so I think it really is about that self acceptance, which since a lot of people do struggle with that, right? I usually start talking about radical acceptance, which is you just have to accept it as is for what it is, and that's it. And what would happen if you do that, right? And then sometimes I like to do worst case scenario so people can find out like it's not really that bad. Sometimes it'll get really big and then we talk about that. But for the most part, like if it's about trying to come up with something like that, I'll just use the gym example. If you can't live up to the 2 days, how are you going to feel about it? Or how, if you can't live up to the 1 day, how are you going to feel about it? And it's one of those like worst case scenario, nothing happens. You didn't go to the gym, right? So I think it's about practicing radical acceptance in little spots like that. So that way you don't feel like something crazy is going to happen if I don't do that, or I'm going to fail if I don't do that. So back to the idea of flexibility with yourself.
And do you find that it's a fine balance? Because at a certain point, I think there can be too much flexibility and it can just be like we're craving comfort. I don't know if that's a neurodivergent thing
Yeah.
or not, but that's something that I've noticed as I've gotten older is I don't want to do as many things that are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Even if I know it's good for me, I know all the things, it's good to do uncomfortable things, but we crave comfort. So that's where our brain's going to be like, the gym's uncomfortable, don't go. But at a
I'm
certain
fine with
point,
doing it.
we need
Yeah.
to do it, right? We need to do the thing. So what advice do
Hmm.
you have for when that's the debate in your brain? You just got to do the thing.
Yeah, that's a fair question. That's a totally fair question, especially for my ADHD people. We do run a loose ship, is what I call it, right? Or yeah, just let it go. We'll let the sales take it. I think that's back to okay, to compare, right? If you're a rigid person, you need a balance with flexibility. But if you're already a super flexible person, you need a balance with some rigidness. And because the rigidness doesn't have to be bad, the flexibility doesn't have to be bad. So rigidness, if you're having to balance out with a little bit more rigidity, then maybe that is like structuring your schedule or structuring morning, even if it's not the schedule for the entire day, it's at least put in some kind of structure in the sense of for 10 minutes in the morning when I wake up, I don't care if you go stare at trees or meditate or listen to music for 10 minutes, but give yourself some time, right? Even if it's scheduling just self care, right? Most people think that's like massages and petties, but it's also like doctor visits, right? So it's like those type of things that like we're not going to be balancing with flexibility because we probably haven't ever been to the doctor in 2 years if we're running that kind of loose shit. So it's okay, I need to balance out with being a little bit more rigid by implementing self-care, things like that, right? And if you're having a hard time with that, you might be in executive dysfunction. And then we start working backwards from there. How did you get into executive dysfunction? Were you burnt out? Did we not realize we were burnt out? You know what I mean? So then you start doing that whole thing.
No, that's helpful. One thing that I ask my clients to write out in their little, like they have a daily check-in that I review
Mm.
weekly. And this one's optional. They don't have to fill it out every day because trust me, I know that it's not realistic to always have a win or a self-care of the day, but they have a little spot that I'm just like, tell me one thing that happened that was great or that you did for yourself. And I'm always like, you don't have to go get a manicure. It can literally be, I shaved my legs in the shower, or I called my best friend, or I finally washed the dishes. It literally doesn't matter. I watched a movie by myself. It can be
Yeah,
any little thing that you do for yourself that made you feel a little bit better.
exactly. How did you care for yourself?
More or less.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think if people opened up to the idea that it's not just about petties and haircuts, which are great, don't get me wrong.
Or being
Uh,
productive. I think a lot of people feel like they can't do anything for themselves unless it is productive.
yeah, or even sometimes I feel like people, especially moms, bless their hearts, they feel if they put time into themselves, they're being selfish.
Yeah,
Right. But like that whole idea of like how actually I always think about this on an airplane, right? When you get in on an airplane and they're doing the whole like safety thing, they always tell the parents to put their mask on before their child's, right? Because how are they going to help their child if they can't breathe? You know what I mean? So same thing with like your emotional cup. You have to fill your emotional cup. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to engage with others. And then that might be burnout, that might be withdrawal and executive dysfunction.
for sure. Yes. And especially like for my coaches listening to this, that's something that I've really noticed over the years is we get into this and we want to be the coach that answers all of our client messages within 1 hour. We want to be the one that
Yeah.
drops everything to pick up the phone. But in all reality, like you have to protect your peace. Like you have to have boundaries.
Yes.
You have to have that space for yourself. What we do, as much as it's important, it's not life or death,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
no one's going to
Maybe
die. They
symptoms.
can go to the emergency room. We are not 911. And if you want
Yes.
911, then that's fair. If that's you,
That's for you.
or a nine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's something else that I always repeat to clients. I try to, even if they're not coaches or what teachers, even a lot of my teachers are burnt at both ends because
Oh my gosh.
that's
Teaching.
the whole thing. You've taught.
Yeah. That could be a whole other podcast.
Yes, it could. It could be.
Yeah.
You know that all too well. But it really is helpful to find ways to build your own cup, your own
Hmm.
reserve. And that brings us into the topic of emotional resilience. So, what are some ways that, especially as neurodivergents, but even just in general, as women, we can build emotional resilience when life feels overwhelming or progress towards our goal feels too slow and it just feels impossible?
Yeah. I think you said one word that is very helpful for almost everything we've talked about, including emotional regulation, is boundaries. Boundaries are so important, especially for those who did not grow up in a family with boundaries. If you're in mesh, triangulated, whatever the dynamic is in your family, boundaries are so important because you will overextend yourself, right? Especially with enmeshment type stuff, you will overextend yourself because you feel in charge of others' emotions, right? And then if you're an empath on top of that, oh my gosh, you're tired. You're so tired. And so boundaries are very important. It doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you're selfish, right? I think boundaries is even self care, back to that. And that'll help with the emotion regulation because you've already got these things in place. But then there's other things too that can be more of like an intervention. I feel boundaries is probably more prevention. So the intervention is maybe even starting off with just psychoeducation. You know what I mean? What is emotion dysregulation? Why does it happen? How can I? The same thing with the overwhelming stuff, because this is most likely why we get dysregulated is because we're overwhelmed, right? And so, what are those things that overwhelm you? Do you have a support system that you can talk to, or do you have a safe space? If you're like talking to people is out of the question when I like this, totally fair. Right. But I think it's also about finding a safe space for yourself because for some people, it's that emotion dysregulation of feeling unsafe. They may not even realize that they're feeling unsafe. How you know that is it your fight or flight reactive? Right. And if your fight or flight is reactive because emotion dysregulation, then it's you really do need to find a safe space or you need to have that safe person that's able to tell you you are safe, you're fine. No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to argue with you or whatever rejection sensitivity might bring on. Right. So there's that. And then there's other things like understanding your window of tolerance, right? So your window of tolerance might be a zone where you feel present in the moment, you're calm, you're thinking clearly, but then maybe something triggers you, right? Maybe it's that overwhelming amount of crowds or sounds or whatever it is. And so there's two things. So like window of tolerance, and then you might become like hyper aroused or hypo aroused. And some people experience both. Some people are like one or the other. And so hyper aroused is more like aggression and becoming reactive, that fight or flight, right? And then the hypo arousal is more of dissociating, intrusive thoughts, shutting down, and like getting super fatigued. And so I think, again, understanding, are you the type to get hyper aroused? Are you a hypo arousal person? Are you both? And then understanding what takes you out of that window of tolerance. And if you are already experiencing like that little transition to outside your window, then it's about, am I having a lot of intrusive thoughts, which means I'm super anxious in the situation right now, right? Am I feeling that fight or flight and I'm feeling unsafe? Go find your support system. So I think, again, it's about having resources, support, and then being able to use those as interventions in the moment.
No, that's really helpful. And you mentioned a lot of times it's understanding what those triggers are and when you start to feel those things so that way you
Mm,
can intervene before you get to total dysfunction.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that also leads to, which is also important for emotion resilience, is the mindfulness and the managing sensory needs, right? Because people aren't always going to know if, like, especially if they don't know you and like you're in a restaurant or something, right? They're not going to know when you're overwhelmed. And so it's about you knowing. So that way you can adjust to your needs or at least communicate to other people how they can help you adjust. Or because it's, again, fine balance. I think everything's fine balance of being able to communicate your needs because you need support, but also realizing people aren't mind readers. They're not going to know. And just because we're good at understanding body language sometimes doesn't mean that other people are.
Definitely. And I'm curious what tools, I don't know if they're tools, routines, or habits that you recommend for balancing struggling with your mental health with just the demands of life and existing.
Yeah. I think one word that would be great is intentional, being intentional about things. I think that helps you stay in the present moment and then also helps you stay aligned to yourself. And these aren't even necessarily like preventative things. These are just things you can do as you're living your life minute to minute, right? About I need to make a decision. Let's be intentional about this decision so I can get XYZ that I'm envisioning. I think it does go back to a lot of what we talked about too, though, is like the self care. How am I caring for myself? So a lot of neurodivergent people might struggle with even hygiene. You know what I mean? It's just not that it's not important for them, but they just sometimes it's sensory stuff in the sense of don't like the way the brush feels in their mouth, or like they don't care about their bed being made or changing the sheets, stuff like that. And so I think it's about learning how to care for yourself also, right? Knowing, managing your sensory needs because you understand what they are, right? So it's a little bit of a, I think, a balance of intervention and prevention things.
Hmm.
And it's okay that prevention might start at any time. Because again, if you weren't diagnosed as a child and you've had all these preventative things instilled for you, you can still do that if you're late diagnosed, right? You just have to be intentional about finding these things out about yourself and be intentional about finding those coping skills or at least implementing the coping skills that you do have or you've learned.
That's helpful. And in closing and reflecting on everything, if somebody is listening to this and is maybe even feeling overwhelmed by everything we discussed, maybe they're like, oh shit, am I ADHD? Is this me? Am I relating to this? What is one
Mhm.
small step that they can take today to just feel more empowered or feel more comfortable with what they're feeling?
Yeah, yeah. I think small step is the word to use for that, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed by everything we've talked about. And if you're resonating with it, psychoeducation, I think, is so important. It's usually what I start with in my session, the first few sessions, is just at least like letting the person know this is a thing, right? You're not crazy, you're not weird, like these things exist. And so I think it's about maybe even seeking like professionals to talk about it. So maybe if you have neurodivergent friends, sharing experiences to see how you relate to them and what resonates. As much as I'm fine with self diagnosis, I think that can be equally as successful for a person. I do have a little soapbox about watching TikTok sometimes. because I just feel like it's over, right? So if you have a person on a TikTok and they're like doing this, like with all the words and shit, right? It's those three things that they wrote doing this might look like anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD. So it's that person might be like, oh shit, do I have all four of them? You know what I mean? When really it's just one of them, but because those three criteria they listed is so generalized, they don't know. Right. And before you freak yourself out with Dr. Google or anything like that, it's talk to the people who already have these experiences or are educated in it, certified in it, something. So that way you have real information, not what you are reading into. Because sometimes we could do that too, right? If our anxiety is so high, we might bias, right? We might be reading biasly into something and be like, oh my God, I have borderline personality disorder. And you're like, Jesus, let's talk about it. It's fine if you do, then maybe talk about why you think you do. Right. But like really having that open conversation.
Yes. And stopping the Google rabbit hole before it gets destructive.
I think it's that too. Okay, if you want to do Dr. Google, totally fine, but have an open mind to know this may not be you, or to stop when you're starting to get,
This may not be that helpful, depending
yeah,
on the state that you are in.
it makes you further or make you feel worse. You know what I mean? So before you save yourself from yourself, don't do that to yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I tell my girls that with health stuff as well. Just because your poop looked weird one time doesn't mean you have stomach cancer. You're good. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
Or that you're
That's a good point.
pregnant. Because almost anything that you Google, it's going to come up with pregnancy.
Yeah, or some kind of cancer or
Yeah,
something. Maybe one day they'll weed all that out.
I doubt it because that's what keeps people going to the doctors, which that's a whole
True.
nother
Whole other
conversation,
podcast.
whole other podcast. But, and with all of your work, what would you say is one of the most important lessons that you've learned working with neurodivergent individuals with regards to resilience and self-acceptance?
Yeah, I feel like I learn something every day from clients. I'm just a very curious person too. So as soon as they say one thing that like I like the way they said it. Even if I know about it, I like the way they said it. I need to know what their process of thinking is. So I learn things all the time from people and things that I've seen in people that help them comes after the self acceptance because it truly breaks my heart how many neurodivergent people come in, whether they're diagnosed or not, that have such negative self talk. The negative self talk is so real for so many people. And it doesn't just have to be a neurodivergence thing. I think it's just increased in neurodivergence because we're constantly having to reevaluate or think about thinking, or while we're talking, we're already thinking about something else. Right. And so there's just so much going on. There's so much chatter. We have inner narrator going on. Not everybody has that. I think all of those things that I have learned are so much stronger than I imagined. Right. And so again, it's that radical acceptance to say, this is who I am. How am I going to help myself? How am I going to adjust so I can stay more present? Or sometimes sensory stuff, it just really depends if you can sit in it or not. And I think that something else that I've learned from people, or people have learned a lot, is to also be okay with the fact that they're not going to be like everybody else. Even if you are in the tribe of neurodiverse, even though we share similar stuff, your stuff is still going to be different. And that's okay. It doesn't make you not enough or something's wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just meeting yourself where you're at, remembering perception is reality, and coming from like a place of like compassion with yourself. Because again, us being such empaths, we are very compassionate and loving towards other people a lot of times, but we do not do that to ourselves nearly as much. And so sometimes it's also about coming from a place of compassion and turning it around on yourself. So that way you do the self care, you talk back to that negative self talk, right? And sometimes there are even shadows, which is trauma stuff, right? But yeah, I think it's about being intentional, psychoeducation, understanding there's nothing wrong with you because you're different. It's just a difference, not a deficit, right? And maybe even dealing with trauma if you have trauma. Even if it's, some people have a hard time distinguishing whether they have trauma or not. But again, perception is reality. If it was traumatizing to you, it was traumatizing to you. I don't care if you're like in kindergarten, somebody stole your lunchbox and that felt traumatizing. That was traumatizing. You know what I mean? Just let it be. So it's whatever that is to you. I think it's about addressing it, sitting in it, being intentional about what you're going to do with it, right? And going from there and accepting it all and that radical acceptance.
Yeah. The radical acceptance is big because I feel like I even
Mm.
have friends that are neurodivergent and they spend so much time, and I can fall into this too, just being like, it's so easy for other people. Like, why do I have to deal with this? Like, why does my brain do this?
Mm.
And that's really never helpful to blame your
No,
brain or to think that way. It's really not. We could spend that time learning new ways that do work for our brains in the
hmm Yeah, I think that's a good point because I think something else that could be really helpful for resilience and self acceptance. Oh my gosh. Again, so many thoughts. I think that's what happens. I get so many thoughts and so excited that I'm like, just, yeah, just meh. Can you say that last part again?
oh gosh, okay.
I love this. I love this so much.
I'm like ready for you to say something so I don't even
Yeah,
remember
I
what
know.
I just said. Oh gosh.
We're modeling for
Oh,
people. This is what neurodivergence looks like.
this is real life. That's why I love clients that are neurodivergent because they're just like trying to form their thoughts, and I get it. It's okay. Just keep going. I understand.
Yeah, let them sit in it for sure.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
sure.
Oh gosh, I said something about how a lot of people will spend time being mad at their brains for not working like other people's instead of accepting it and just learning how to work with it instead of being mad at it. And you said something.
Yeah, that's okay. I have no idea. That's fine. I think you're totally, yes. I was like, there'll be a whole other thing on this. But yeah, I think it really is about being intentional and just the self combating that negative self talk, aligning values, right? And that's what it was. It's not helpful, right? It's not helpful to feed into those things. And I think if anything, it's just going to make you feel worse. It's going to make you feel guilty for yourself, for others, feel like you're not enough. I'm not like other people. And it is totally a human thing to want to fit in. Even if you're like, I don't care what people think. Sure. Okay. That's fine. But at some point, there's going to be like this animalistic part of you that feels like you need some sort of tribe or you resonate to somebody, right? Otherwise, it feels pretty lonely. And I think that can happen too. But again, I think if you're feeling that loneliness, you have some negative self talk, there's some radical acceptance that needs to be done, things like that.
Definitely. Yeah. I think this was a super helpful episode, and hopefully it helps you listening to this find your tribe. I think that was a really great point that you made because if you're not in the right group of people, whether it's friends or work or family or just whoever you include in your life, then you're always going to feel like something is off or something is wrong.
Mm.
And I found this in my adult friendships, if you surround yourself with the right people, you can just be yourself and you don't even have to think twice about what that means. Because I think some people
Hmm.
overthink, what is my identity? What am I doing? When it's just, no, just find people that you really don't care and you can just exist and vibe and do your thing.
Yeah, I really believe what you put out there is what comes back to you. And so if you're putting your authentic self out there, you're going to attract those people who like those parts of you. And then they feel like they can unmask around you. You're unmasking. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're unmasking until we separate from that person. You go home and you're like, oh shit, that felt nice. I was just myself. I guess that's what unmasking feels like. And so if you have to question whether or not you unmask, you probably didn't. And so I think it's about finding those people where you're like, oh shit, that felt good.
Instead of a social experience being exhausting. That's how I know. Like at this point, I can tell if a social
Yeah.
experience is going to be exhausting before I go, or if it's going to be one of those things that you leave and you just like, can't wait to do it again thing.
Yeah. And then for some people, it's the extrovert of me like that, but the introvert of me is like, why did you do that?
Yes. Or why did you make
Listen,
that plan that you have to go to tomorrow? And then you go and you're like, that's great.
exactly. So that part is like getting over the hump of the fears and being like, okay, you've done this using evidence. Using evidence, I have done this before. It was so much fun. And I do have the energy. So once I'm there, I know I'm going to have a good time. Now, I think the flexibility part is still weighing out those fears. But if you are truly exhausted and we're on our way to burnout, executive dysfunction, don't fucking do it.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of like how you can balance that, whether or not you are a loose ship kind of person or a rigid person, right? It's just remembering to evaluate yourself where you are in the moment, meeting yourself where you're at to make those decisions. And I think that's also part of the intentional decision, right? Is like evidence shows I'm going to have a good time, just get to the thing and you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
Right. And that would be intentional, or the intention of, I really do want to do this thing, even though I'm a little fearful of it, but I am so fucking exhausted that if I do this, it's going to put me over. I'm not going to be able to move for 3 days.
And being able to know that definitely takes time and you're going to find out the hard way to a degree. And that can be true with exercise too, right?
Oh
More
yeah.
than not, people will tell themselves, I don't want to go, but I'm going to feel better after. And I do believe that
Hmm.
majority of the time that is true. But if
Yeah.
this is where something I'll work with my clients on is, I don't know if you could call it auto regulation of being able to inventory what is true, right?
Yeah.
If it's true
Yeah.
that you're like, I slept 8 or 9 hours last night, I'm pretty well fueled, I am just being lazy, you should probably go. But if you're like,
Yeah.
kid was up last night, my dog barfed in my bed, I slept for 3 hours, I barely ate anything besides breakfast today, you're
Yeah.
probably not going to benefit from that workout. You're going to benefit from relaxing, eating a dinner, and going the heck to bed. And then
Hmm.
gym the next day after you've actually been able to recover your body. So that's
Yeah.
where I think having the information is really helpful instead of just acting out of emotion. When the emotional
Hmm.
part of us, in terms of going to the gym, will be like, I'm going to gain 30 pounds if I don't go. Is that
So
true?
the if then this
Is
then that,
that
right?
really true? Yeah. So I liked how you brought up what's really a fact versus what isn't.
Yeah, because feelings aren't always facts, right? Even though they might feel so strong, feelings are not always facts. And there's a difference between thoughts and feelings, right? And so I think there's a point where you have to ask yourself, is this a feeling and I need to assess that? Or are these truly my thoughts? And are they intrusive thoughts or are they real thoughts?
This is my last question. How do you tell the difference if they're intrusive or if they're real?
I was like, I love this question. So that's fine. Because I love talking about the difference between intrusive thoughts and intuition. Because I think of thoughts as intuition, right? So intrusive thoughts are going to feel intrusive. Like they're going to feel bad. They're not going to feel good. It's going to be that if this, then that,
Yep.
right? If I don't call my mom when she's heading to the airport, her airplane's going to crash. What, right? So a lot of times they don't even make sense. They're pretty irrational, right? And even if you can rationalize them because they're intrusive, they still don't feel good. They don't feel right. And then when you have the intuition, it's more of course, like the gut feeling, right? But it's also more rational. Even if you're like, oh, that's uncomfortable, it can be uncomfortable, but it's not bad. It's not like someone's gonna die. You know what I mean? It's more of this is the reasonable thing that's going to get me to XYZ. I just know it feels uncomfortable because it's a lot to do, or I'm not used to doing that, or I had to put myself out there, or whatever it is, right? I feel like it's about, again, it's always hard in the beginning trying to build that mindfulness or the awareness because you're thinking about thinking, which can be exhausting. But the more you practice it, just like anything, it becomes second nature. Your intuition gets louder than those intrusive thoughts do.
Oh, that's helpful. It's like a different
Hmm.
feeling.
Yeah. And it could feel the same. But I think once you start being more intentional and gaining the mindfulness and awareness of it, then you start realizing that both of those voices are my voices, but they are two totally different things. Right? It really is almost like the angel and the devil thing. Intrusive thoughts are coming in to be like, and just make fun of us, right? Whereas the intuitions, hey, this actually might be better if you do it this way. It might suck because it's uncomfortable, but it's going to be better for your higher self.
No, that's helpful. Cool. Alexis, this has been a really fun episode. I learned a
Yeah.
lot and I'm very excited for this to drop. So, if somebody listening to this is like, all right, she seems awesome, how do I talk to her about therapy or even just a simple conversation? How can they reach you?
So email is going to be the best. Working on social media stuff. It's not my greatest moment. So I would email me at Alexis, Alexis at floatoncounseling.com.
Awesome. And I'll put that in the show notes in case anybody needs it. She is honestly amazing and super easy to talk to, as I'm sure you've already realized. So if you're listening to this episode and you found it helpful, please make sure that you subscribe, share it with a friend who might need it, because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that would love to hear this. And if you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. I don't remember if I already said that or not. I might have. If I did, subscribe 2 times. And thank you so much for hanging out with us today.